Imagine yourself faced with the reality of your own mortality and shown a scene from the afterlife. That is precisely what happened to mechanic and devout Christian John on a warm day while he fished in the Brazos River. As Jesus battled for his life, John was already outside of his body, standing before him. Simultaneously, he'd witnessed God's judgment procedure for the deceased. His path was illuminated by the dedication and generosity of those who had committed their lives to serving others. John saw the selfish and cruel behavior of those who had put their own needs before those of others. When John landed back on Earth, he felt that he had a new chance to live his life to the fullest and change the world for the better. This is the touching story of John's near-death experience and how it altered his life. My dad had mentioned that one day during our summer vacation he was planning to go fishing in the Brazos River. So that I could play in the water while he cast his line, I begged him to let me come along. My dad drove us to the river, and 4 of my neighbors got in too. We dashed into the water as quickly as possible after jogging the 30 or 40 yards to Dad's fishing spot. After an hour or so of water play, my dad said that he was going upstream and asked us to tag along. Wading downstream, we followed the bank. Out of the 5 kids, I was the only one who had never swum before. I trailed the group by perhaps 10 yards. While wading upstream, I stumbled into a hole and fell. It was all over in an instant. I hardly had time to catch my breath. After accidentally swallowing some water, I began to cling to the surface. Upon reaching the surface, I started to spit water, but I was unable to pause for air before diving back under. The number of times this disagreement had occurred had me on the verge of passing out. Frustration and exhaustion set in after a while of struggling. I was so mad with myself for not breathing enough air as I writhed in the water, as I struggled to keep my head above water. I gave up after a while of fighting off exhaustion. Everything seemed to be moving at a glacial pace, and I felt painfully slow, as if I were in a movie or TV show. By this point, my arms and legs were worthless due to the snail's speed at which they were moving. I knew I was physically departing from my body. I had lost interest in trying to balance 2 realities as I stared at my aging body. My body was on the ground and my mind was in the sky. I wasn't actually in 2 places at once. I watched my body writhe in the water from where I stood, but I didn't feel the water or the effort. My ascent continued thereafter, and I eventually hovered about 10 feet above the water. It was amazing to be above water, and I was relieved that I hadn't gulped down too much water, which would have caused me pain and exhaustion from my battle below. I beheld a glowing disk about 20 feet away. It was glaringly bright and hanging at eye level while I pondered my dilemma. It seemed to spin about inside its own confines like smoke in the air and emitted extraordinarily brilliant rays of light. Its size was comparable to that of a basketball. In the center of the light beam, I noticed a small, entirely black dot. I just couldn't tear my gaze away from that tiny dot. As I stared at it, it grew larger and closer. Eventually, Jesus came out of it and stood before me. Without giving it any thought, I put up my hands to shield myself and signaled for him to stop. I felt unworthy to be in his company since he was a holy, innocent being. Because I am only a mortal, I am corrupted by the evil in this earthly world. The second he made contact with me, all of my feelings of shame and worthlessness vanished. He stood before me with an aura of grandeur. A radiant golden light emanated from him in all directions, and his complexion was rich and golden. Even though human eyes cannot fathom its speed, a little over 186,000 miles per second, I could perceive this majestic light emanating from him in all its glory. I am at a loss for words to express the exquisite glow that he exuded. It wasn't just that I could see it. This light also seemed to breathe spiritual life into me. From this light, Jesus' wisdom, love, and kindness seemed to emanate in all directions, penetrating my own soul. As I bowed down to inspect it, my complexion looked as pale as snow. Beard and long hair bedecked him as he stood before me, dressed just as he was 2,000 years ago, as we see him portrayed in art. Even though I can't put my finger on it, he did speak to me. "Do not be worried. Quietly rest," he remarked. His voice was incredibly high-pitched and commanding. Being deaf has made it difficult for me to hear and talk since I was a little child. Both attending and doing well in class were challenges for me. My hearing loss made it difficult for me to understand and participate in class discussions, and it also made it extremely difficult for me to pass the exams needed to advance to the next grade. Conversely, when Jesus spoke to me, my hearing was unimpaired and unclouded. I thought his voice was quite lovely and melodic. Our lips stayed frozen in place regardless of how much we spoke to one another. It's almost as if extraterrestrials helped us communicate. Something much more strange occurred when I attempted to strike up a discussion with him. When he heard me, I still hadn't even uttered a word. It was as if he had telepathic powers. The second an idea occurred to me, he knew just what I was going to say. This is how we spoke to each other. Out of nowhere, a massive screen appeared right before our eyes. This massive screen transported me to the golden age of drive-in theaters. Because we were so close to it, the screen appeared enormous. In a variety of settings, the events of my little existence were unfolding on this screen. It was as if my whole life was being recorded on this world, where scenes appeared to be looping endlessly. Every scene came after the next in a completely random order, with no discernible link between them. The belief that our entire lives are reenacted in a haze when we die has long been held. This is exactly what was happening in my life when Jesus directed my attention to a certain scenario. The scene grew until it almost filled the screen as our conversation became the main attraction. On the other hand, I could still discern a number of peripheral situations. As we watched the opening scene, he asked me a lot of questions regarding what had happened. He was curious as to why I had deceived my mother, yanked my sister's hair, pelted my dog with rocks, and yanked on the tail of my neighbor's cat. During the time we were together, I lied to someone more than once. I tore someone's clothes for no apparent reason, casually insulted them, and bullied them among the innumerable cases I watched. He found something terrible I did or something really good I did it in every scene we reviewed. As we went over each scene, I had to respond and explain what I did. I was constantly aware that my description of each scene was completely inaccurate. He stepped in and corrected me when I tried to downplay the seriousness of my actions. He was quite complimentary of me if I did anything nice in a scene. It was common for Jesus to burst into fits of laughter whenever anything funny happened. If you ask him, he's hilarious. In comparison to the number of scenarios where I was unsuccessful, the number of scenes where I succeeded was significantly smaller. I knew I was in over my head with him because my fear of hell had risen. As soon as the screen vanished, he extended his hand to grasp mine. Gravity sent us whizzing through a tunnel at breakneck speed. Like a denser kind of smoke rising from an open fire, the tunnel's walls, ceiling, and floor seemed to be constantly churning. At high speeds, stationary roadside objects like trees or power poles appear to whiz by. Despite my lack of awareness of the tunnel's motion, I felt as though the room's surfaces were spinning rapidly, including the walls, ceiling, and floor. I can only describe the arrangement of the room in terms of the firmament in Genesis. As I took in all this information about the tunnel, the passing of time became quite clear to me. I could see a fairway light when I looked forward. When I had the epiphany, we're finally getting there, my rationality vanished. As my aquatic companion approached me, he subtly placed his hand on my foot. My desperate efforts to reach the surface were met with further submersion as I gasped for air. My companion swam to my side, crept up between my thighs, and dove under me to help me emerge. He then began swimming for the shore. As if I'd never breathed such exquisite air before, I gasped for breaths. I could tell he was struggling because we swam a little distance together on my back. Knowing I may drown him if I kept pressing down too hard, I put one leg over his and lowered myself gently into the water. As my toes touched the riverbed, he climbed out, gasping for air. By the time we reached the shore, we were both dead. My vomit started to contain the river water that I had swallowed throughout the battle. I felt like I was about to pass out from drinking so much water. I had to throw up water at least 15 times before I started dry heaving again, and then maybe another 10 or 15. I was in excruciating pain all over. My stomach hurt from dealing with all the water and the prolonged episodes of vomiting and heaving, and I was fatigued from the fight. My body hurt for 2 weeks after that. After participating in all of the day's events, my dad gave us a ride home. I totally forgot about the sections about the tunnel and Jesus. Reflecting on the event in the days and weeks that followed, it seems like everything had transpired in a flash. Certain time had gone by when I happened upon a newspaper article detailing someone's near-death experience. Portions of his story seemed to bring back certain recollections. I finally realized that the shock I had felt at the moment had caused me to acquire post-traumatic stress disorder. As a result, I no longer remembered what had happened. I felt like I was searching my brain for an eternity before the memories came flooding back. Next up, we have a near-death experience that you won't want to miss. It involves a woman whose mind-bending story is packed with intriguing information.